Hello chess friends and welcome to Jozarov's chess channel and welcome back to the Goldmoney Asian Rapid Tournament in 2021. We're now back in the quarterfinal stage and we're following the great match game between Magnus Carlsen and Wesley. So we're now in the second game of the first day of the quarterfinals, and in the first game Magnus Carlsen won the game, I think with a little bit of a luck. Wesley really blundered at the end and then he had to resign. I think Wesley played really decent game in the game one. Now we're in the game two. It's really time now also for Wesley to make something happen. If Magnus gets now a draw, then of course in the next two games it will be very hard for Wesley to catch up with Magnus Carlsen. So let's check out now the second game. I think it was also a very cool game, but also with great strategical elements, and I think with great instructive elements of the chess game. So here e4 played by Wesley, we have e5 by Magnus, we have knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4, and now after bishop to c5 we have the gioco piano is on the board, the Italian game, one of the most often played openings even in chess history. So I think there are many sidelines, many great opportunities for white, for black, so it's a very tough battle already by the two top grandmasters. So here c3, Wesley is preparing the d4 pawn breakthrough. Here knight to f6, so far d4 not possible because of the weakness on e4. Here in the continuation d3, the classical variation is on the board, so with a compact setup now in the center, this d4 move has to be then further prepared. In the continuation of the game we have d6, we have castling, we have h6 by Magnus Carlsen, preventing some pinning ideas because the knight is controlling of course the d5 square. In one particular moment black can also hope for a d5 pawn breakthrough in order just to open the position further and simplify the game. So that's why h6 so far a prophylactic move. Here rook to e1, this idea is clear. First of all, this move is also preventing a little bit of the d5 move, because if that happens then the e5 could be a little bit unprotected. But there is also a second part of this particular move. This move comes with the idea then you have to play something like knight to d2, knight to f1, and if you get challenged by the bishop, let's see possible continuation, we get challenged by the bishop, still we can play something like knight to d2. If now castle happens, then we can play h3. Now if this bishop comes to h5, we can then maneuver the bishop to f1 and then challenge it further with the move knight to g3. So in one particular moment I think this bishop will get endangered, and then bishop on g6 wouldn't be such a great piece. So that's why this is a great idea always in the gioco piano to maneuver the knight to f1 and then maybe further to g3. In one particular moment also we can maybe occupy the weak square. It's of course the weak f5 square. So here in the continuation after move rook to e1, castling was played by Magnus Carlsen. We have knight from b to d2, we have now a4 a6 preparing of course b5, so that's why here after move knight to f1, bishop to a7 here by Magnus, and now comes this move a4 preventing b5 as a long-term plan to attack further here the queen side. So in the continuation we have rook to e8 played by Magnus. This position has been reached millions and millions of times. I think in chess history this is a very often played line. I think what both players are relying here always is this long diagonal of the light square bishop for white and the dark square bishop for black, because there are always these targets. f2 and f7 are the basic tactical targets. If something can happen, it will probably happen around these two squares. So here in the continuation now Wesley is playing also this prophylactic idea h3. We have bishop to e6. Magnus is trying to get rid of this very annoying bishop. Here Wesley plays bishop to e6 and now rook to e6. Here Magnus Carlsen can recapture the bishop without messing up the pawn structure here with his double pawns on the e file. Although it could be also a possibility, because we have said even if you take now f takes e6, when it comes to computer evaluations this is not the best of moves for black, but actually this pawn on e6 is preventing also very important ideas. First of all, it prevents maybe this potential knight outpost that we have talked about, the potential knight outpost of the knight on f5. We have said that that would be sort of a square that black would that white would love to occupy, so that's why this is also playable line still for black. So after move bishop to e6, still Magnus plays rook to e6, and now Wesley plays of course on the queen side expansion. We have queen to d7. Here Magnus Carlsen is trying now also to connect maybe the rooks with rook to e8. Pardon me. In the continuation we have queen to c2 by Magnus, pardon me, by Wesley. So sorry, I have some trouble. Okay, here after queen to c2, what Wesley is preparing here is the move bishop to b2, maybe as a long-term plan. Then maybe this idea knight to g3, and then if it's possible somehow maybe rook to b1, and then maybe to break through with d4. But this is a huge preparation. Meanwhile of course black is doing also something. Here d5 is always a great liberating line for black to occupy somehow the center with the knight. Then maybe after knight to d5 maybe also ideas like knight to f4 f4 could work in the continuation of the game. So here d5 immediately by Magnus Carlsen. He realizes that Wesley So is trying also to support the center, so that's why this is so far a good idea by Magnus. And now bishop to e3. Now Wesley is also getting rid of this very active bishop. We have said in the middle of our analysis that these two bishops were simply the best pieces on the board, so that's why trading off both of them is actually a great choice by Magnus Carlsen, but also here by Wesley So. Bishop to e3, knight to e3, and now knight to e7. Here c4 was played by Wesley. This move knight to e7 is again a prophylactic move here by Magnus. He's preventing this knight to f5 idea by Wesley, because that's the square that we really want to occupy. Now after move knight to e7, c4 here by Wesley So, what Wesley So is trying here to do is to get a clarification, because whatever happens, if you take, we simply take, then the pawn structure is again symmetrical. Then rook to d1 could happen maybe, then afterwards Wesley So could search also for outposts here on d5. So that's why Magnus pushed the pawn on d4, gets a space advantage in the center. But now a great move by Wesley So, knight to f5, because Wesley realized that of course this e5 is a long-term weakness. That's actually sort of a pawn that is only protected by the rook. So in a potential continuation, if you try knight to f5, this wasn't played in the game, then e takes f5, rook to e8 has to be played, and then maybe knight to e5. Of course Magnus can also recapture the pawn, but still this is a centralized knight. I think from this point on, I think white has a comfortable game. Knight to f3 will happen, and then maybe queen to b2, maybe attacking further also the weak pawn on d4. So in the continuation, after move knight to f5, here a5 was played by Magnus. We have now b5. Here Wesley So is solving now the positional problems on the queen side. Has now a static pawn structure on the queen side, so that's why no problems, at least on that side of the board. Now the game has the direction of the game has changed towards the king side, because that's actually where all of the minor pieces are, where all the activity is here. So that's why so far a good game by both sides. So here after move b5, Magnus is trying to get again a clarification here on the queen side with the move c5. If you take now b takes c6, that wouldn't be good continuation here for Wesley, because knight to c6 will happen, and then you lose a little bit the battle, because the knight can be here cemented around the square b4. So far after move c5, here Wesley So left the position on the queen side like that. He said, okay, we have solved now all of the position problems on the queen side. The pawn structure on the queen side is blocked. Now let's go to the king side, and let's make something on that side of the board. So here knight to h4 was played, because if knight to f5, again knight to f5, another knight will come here on this very active square. Then maybe even with ideas queen to e2, queen to f3, and maybe queen to g3. If you could just imagine with the position with the knight to f5 here, then the queen comes somewhere here, maybe here to g3. Then here the king will be already very endangered. Even I think with f4, maybe rook to f1, rook to f3, and then rook to g3. This could be also an opportunity to maybe create a rook lift here on that side of the board. So far you don't want to take, of course, the knight on f5. So here after move knight to h4, here in the continuation knight to g6 was played by Magnus Carlsen. A tricky move, because if you play now knight takes g6, then f takes g6, and finally Magnus would solve all of the positional problems. This pawn, although it's a double pawn structure, but now this knight will never jump on this very active square on f5. So here in the continuation after knight to g6, here Wesley played g3. He is preventing also a potential knight f4 outpost here by Magnus. If Magnus now takes, of course, then of course we can recapture with the knight, and still the pawn structure wouldn't be messed up in the continuation of the game. So here knight to e8, we have king to h2. We have a knight to d6, we have queen to e2. Here we have knight to h4, knight takes h4, and now queen to e7, and here again knight to f5. Queen to e7 was really not the best of moves here by Magnus Carlsen. A better idea is maybe queen to d8, or here rook to e8, because here Wesley So, although it's an equal game, smelled really some blood, because here after move queen to e7, now again Magnus faces the tactical problems around the square e5, because now Wesley can play the move knight to f5, because if you take now knight to f5, e takes f5, then you have to move the rook. You see, there's no good square for the rook, so that's why the queen on e7 stands a little bit in the way, and now the pawn is hanging here on e5. So I think in a potential endgame, if we grab this pawn on e5, this could be a winning continuation for Wesley So. So after move knight to f5, Magnus realized his problem, played now queen to f6, and now Wesley So takes, knight takes d6. We have rook to d6, but now rook to f1, and see now the queen is already already there where the rook is. Now what we want to do is of course open simply the f file. Here rook to e8, f4, we have queen to d8, we have queen to h5, f6 by Magnus. Magnus is trying to get some kind of a static position on the king side, trying to defend his position, although it's an equal game, but the engine gives here a slightly advantage for white because of the space advantage. First of all, black has the space, white has the space advantage on the b file, but also with opportunity to push further the pawns, because here the pawn structure here in front of black's king is already weakened by the move h6, but also by the move f6. But still, this should be probably a draw if you play now this game correctly. In the continuation, we have h4, we have queen to d7. What Magnus is trying now to do is of course simplify the game by trading off the queens. We have rook to f2, we have queen to f7. Here, great choice by Wesley. So he's not trying here to simplify the game, he's staying with many pieces now on the board. If you want to win the game, you have to play actively, you don't want to trade off more pieces, so that's why queen to f3 so far a good idea. So e takes f4, again maybe not the best of moves here by Magnus Carlsen, but because you're getting the pawn structure again dynamic here. You're hoping for this move, you are hoping that white is playing the move f5, then the pawn structure is again blocked out. But now with the move e takes f4, g takes f4, you see, I think Wesley has here a great pawn mobility. These two pawns are mobile, whatever you do, I think you can pass through or creating a supported pass pawn, because if now f5 happens, what Magnus Carlsen did actually, which is really wild, now e5 played here by Wesley. So, and you see now we have now a great endgame strategical element, it's the supported pass pawn. That's something that you should always get when you're playing endgames. The supported pass pawn is really great, because in a potential endgame, if now the queens are off the board, if the rooks are off the board, then white has really a dominant position in the endgame. So that's why the supported pass pawn is something that you should always get in endgame. So here rook to g6, you see now the problems. Here rook to g1 played by Wesley So, and now Magnus takes, rook takes g1. Now Wesley So doesn't mind if the pawn structure and here the position gets more and more simplified, because he has this better strategical element, as we said, the supported pass pawn. Now look at this, king to g1. If you could just imagine now the position without these pieces on the board, still this would be such a great endgame here for Wesley So, because of this advantage on e5. So here b6, rook to g2, we have king to h7, h5. Here Wesley So is paralyzing now the king side. We have rook to e6. Here Magnus Carlsen is preventing some rook to g6 ideas. That would be a great square for the rook. In the continuation of the game, we have king to f2, we have queen to e7, queen to h3, we have a queen to f7, and now king to e1. And now comes really the critical moment of the game. Here Magnus plays now a huge blunder, g6. There are of course better moves. The problem is now always, even if you try something like king to h8 to stop a little bit, then queen to g3 or queen to f3 will happen, with also some check threats here, then maybe to get the queen somewhere here, also maybe attacking the weak pawn on b6. But now what Magnus really did is a huge blunder, although it's a much better position here for white, but still maybe Magnus Carlsen could have played something else and make a draw eventually. But here with the move g6, basically the game is over, because after h takes g6, here we have rook to g6, but now queen to h5, the queen gets pinned. And even if you trade, as we said, even if you trade all of the pieces, then still white is much better because of this e5 pawn. Here you see rook to f6. Here Magnus is trying to simplify the game, but now queen to f7, rook to f7, and now king to f2. We have a rook to e7, and now after move king to g3, actually Magnus Carlsen resigned. What's the problem about this move? Let's see now possible continuations. If you try rook to g7, this could be one continuation. Then of course we can simply play king to h3, and now you see if you trade off the rooks, that's not the problem, because now Magnus Carlsen is basically lost here, because after move here king to h5, we have king to h7, and now we're pushing simply e6. The king has to move here, then we can play even here takes. Here we can take out this one, and now here we can play this Zugzwang position. Here king to e7 has to be played, then king to g6. Then you have to step back from the defense of the pawn. Here Wesley So could take the pawn, and it's simply a lost game. So even if you try here in this position rook to e6, if you don't play rook to g6 to trade off here the rooks, it's actually not even better, because we are simply playing king to h4. We're getting the king very active. Here rook to e7, we said that the black should never trade rid of more pieces. That's then a lost endgame. But now Magnus Carlsen's again lost because of this potential king to h5 move. You can maybe play here rook to e6, preventing maybe some rook to g6 idea. But now Wesley so would play probably a Zugzwang motif, rook to g3, and then you have to play. If you play, of course, with the king, then we're playing again rook to g6, tapping. The king is now not anymore defending this h6. If you play something like rook to e7, then again rook to g6 is a possibility. So it's a lost game. So as said here, even if you try here king to h8, then rook to g6 is again simply winning the game. So really wild stuff. That was now the critical moment. Let's go back here to move g6. After that point, the game was simply over for the world champion. So okay, I hope that you enjoyed this game. I really enjoyed it a lot. So Wesley So is back. I said also in the game one that this is not over for Magnus Carlsen. Wesley So knows his stuff, and Wesley So is really loving this rapid time format chess. He's really the master of this time format. So I'm not sure, as I said, who will win this the quarterfinals, but in my opinion, as I said also in the video one, this is for me sort of a final before the final. So okay, I hope that you enjoyed the game. If you want to see also my previous game that we have analyzed between Wesley So and Magnus Carlsen, here's also the link. And if you like maybe to watch the best engines playing chess, check out my commented chess games played by computers. Here's also the link of our whole playlist. And if you like this content, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. See you soon with some more videos, and chess is the best, of course.